The wolf had not risen in 2 years. I had grown used to saying that sentence in my head. The way a man learns to carry a stone he cannot set down, learns the weight of it so well he stops noticing his own shoulders had curved around it. The wolf had not risen in 2 years. Roth, my bonded wolf, my second heartbeat since I was 16 years old, lay in the den off the great hall of Drevhen Keep and breathed and breathed and breathed, and did nothing else. He had stopped eating the first winter. The healers said grief. They said it as though grief were a season, something that passed. I had looked at them across the den's stone threshold and said nothing, because I understood something they did not. Some grief does not pass. Some grief becomes the ground you stand on. You do not move through it. You build on top of it and hope the foundation holds. The healers came and went, 12 of them over 2 years, from every corner of the Northern Territories. The best, the most celebrated, the ones with long lineages of wolf-bonded knowledge. Roth would not look at them. He would not look at me. He lay on the cold stone with his great silver head on his paws and breathed the way a dying fire breathes, not out yet, but not truly burning either. My counsel had begun leaving the den off the agenda at meetings, not out of kindness, out of the particular cowardice of advisors who have decided something is unsolvable and would rather not be reminded of it. I had let them because the alternative was to acknowledge that my bonded wolf, the creature who had been closer to me than any person in my life, whose heartbeat I had felt as an echo of my own since boyhood, was lying on that stone floor willing himself toward an ending, and there was nothing I could do about it. On the morning I sent for the girl from Fenwick Border, it was because there was simply no one left to send. My steward, Call, had brought me the name with the careful neutrality he used when he thought a suggestion was unlikely to help but could not bring himself to withhold it. A village healer, he said, not wolf-trained, no formal lineage. From Fenwick, which was a half-day's ride north and a collection of maybe 200 people who subsisted on pine harvest and dried fish. She had a reputation among the border settlements for working with injured animals, wolves, elk. Once a snow bear the loggers had found with a crossbow bolt through its shoulder. She had a gift, they said, for sitting with creatures that had given up. I stared at Call for a long moment. For sitting with creatures that had given up. He cleared his throat. I told him to send the invitation. Not a summons. I was not in the habit of summoning border village healers as though they owed me something. An invitation, with provisions for the road and the assurance that she was under no obligation to stay if the wolf would not have her. She arrived at dusk. I was standing in the corridor above the keep's inner ward when the gate opened, and she came through on a bay horse that was clearly the keep's own. She had nothing fine enough to make a journey like this on her own animal. I understood that without being told. She was small. That was the first thing. Small in the way of people who have never had quite enough, who have compressed themselves into the space the world left for them. A gray wool cloak, a leather satchel across one shoulder, dark hair pulled back. She looked up at the keep's walls the way people do when they are deciding whether to be intimidated by something. And then she made whatever private decision she needed to make and looked back down and dismounted without ceremony. She did not look like someone who was going to save anything. I told myself this was not a thing I needed to be fair about. Call met her in the ward and brought her inside. I came down from the corridor and met them in the passage outside the den. She had not been told, apparently, that the Alpha King would be present at this introduction. Call's oversight, or perhaps a mercy he'd intended, and she stopped when she saw me and blinked once, a quick recalibration, and then collected herself and met my eyes with a steadiness I had not expected. Gray eyes, the particular gray of winter light through pine trees, not cold exactly, but accustomed to cold. She bowed her head, brief and respectful, and straightened. "My lord," she said, her voice was quiet and even. She smelled of pine resin and dried herbs and wood smoke, and something else I couldn't name, something that made my chest pull sideways, a sensation so old and strange I dismissed it as fatigue. You understand the situation, I said, not a question. Your bonded wolf is in grief silence, she said. 2 years, won't eat, won't look at the healers. He runs them off, I said. The last one he drove out in under a minute. He does not bite, he simply makes it clear he will not be touched. She nodded slowly, taking this in. She looked at the den door, the heavy oak door closed as it always was. Can I go in? That depends on him, I said. The door has not been locked in 2 years. He does not want visitors. If he runs you off, I will send a horse to see you home safely, and there will be no hard feelings. You will be paid either way. She looked at me for a moment with those gray eyes. Something in her expression was considering, though not unkind, the look of someone deciding whether what they're about to say is worth saying. She said it anyway. You haven't been in. Not an accusation, simply an observation, but it landed the way observations do when they are precisely true. No, I said. She nodded once, as though this told her something useful, and turned back to the door. She did not push it open immediately. She stood with one hand resting on the wood, not gripping, just resting, and was quiet for a moment. Then she eased the door open and went inside. I stood in the corridor and listened. There was no sound of anything going wrong, no scramble of claws, no low warning sound from Roth. Nothing. I stood there for a long time. When I finally allowed myself to look through the gap in the door, Sen, I learned her name from call that evening. I had not thought to ask her directly, was sitting on the stone floor of the den with her satchel beside her and her back against the wall, 3 feet from where Roth lay. She had not tried to touch him. She had not taken out anything from her satchel. She was simply sitting. Her hands were loose in her lap. She was looking at the wolf the way you look at a fire, not doing anything about it, just being in the presence of it. Roth's eyes were open. I had not seen his eyes open in 6 weeks. They were looking at her. I backed away from the door and stood in the corridor with my back against the cold stone wall and breathed, carefully, through the sensation this produced in my chest. It was not grief, exactly. It was adjacent to grief. It was the feeling of watching a door open in a house you had accepted was sealed forever, and not yet knowing whether what came through the door was what you had hoped for or something else entirely. I went back to my duties. I came back that night. She was still there. It was past the second watch. The keep had settled into its night quietness. The hearth fires banked, the guards changed. I came to the den with no particular intention, except that I could not sleep, which had been true for 2 years, and the direction my sleeplessness chose that night was toward the wolf den corridor. The door was still open its careful 2 inches. Through the gap I could see that Sen had not moved much from where she'd been that afternoon. She had taken a candle from her satchel, small and practical, and set it on the stone beside her. In its light she was sitting with one knee drawn up, her arm resting on it, and she was talking. Low and even, the way you talk to an animal that has decided not to be afraid of you, not to convince it of anything, not to instruct it, just to let it become accustomed to the sound of you as something unthreatening. I could not quite make out the words. Something about pine trees, something about what the north had looked like this year, what the first thaw had done to the creek outside her village. Roth had shifted. He was still lying down, but his great silver head had turned, angled fractionally toward her. His eyes were open and he was listening. I pressed my back against the corridor wall and stood there in the dark and listened too. At some point she stopped talking and the den went quiet. I heard her shift position against the wall, the soft sound of someone making the best of stone and cloak as a bed. She was not going home then. She was staying the night. I went back to my rooms. I did not sleep any better than I had before, but the quality of the sleeplessness was different. It was less like lying at the bottom of something dark, and more like lying awake waiting for a sound you can't quite hear yet, but believe is coming. I told myself this was nothing. She was a border village healer who sat quietly with animals. Roth had opened his eyes. These two facts might not even be related. I did not believe myself. The second day I had counsel in the morning, and could not go to the den. I sat at the long stone table with Call and my 4 territorial lords, and listened to the reports from the eastern border settlements and the timber allocation discussions, and the complaint from Lord Venn about the Merit Pack's encroachment on the river crossings. And I gave the appropriate answers and made the appropriate decisions. And the whole time something in the back of my chest was arranged around the question of whether the wolf's eyes were still open. It was Call who told me at midday. He came into my study with his careful face, the face he used when he had something to say that he was not sure I wanted to hear, and said that the healer had not left the den. She had accepted food brought to her by the kitchen and eaten it on the floor of the den, he said, beside the wolf. The wolf had not eaten, but he had not run her off. Call paused. He said the wolf had this morning moved. He had not risen, but he had shifted across the floor by perhaps 2 feet, so that he was closer to where she habitually sat. I looked at the fire in my study grate for a moment. Has she asked for anything? I said. She asked for more candles, Call said, and for someone to water her horse. I told him to make sure the horse was well cared for, and to have the kitchen send whatever she wanted. That afternoon, between the timber accounts and the correspondence with the eastern holds, I went to the corridor outside the den. She was cross-legged on the floor this time, her satchel open beside her, doing something with dried herbs, sorting them, tying them into small bundles, the simple work of keeping one's hands occupied. The wolf was 2 feet closer to her than he had been yesterday. His eyes were open. He was watching her hands. I watched too from the corridor, for longer than I meant to. Her hands were steady, small and capable, the hands of someone who had used them for work all her life, the knuckles a little rough, the movements economical and sure. She was not trying to charm the wolf. She was not performing anything. She was just being in the room, doing her ordinary work, taking up exactly the space she needed and not 1 inch more. I had known in my life a great many people who took up more space than they needed. It had always seemed to me a kind of hunger, a shape of insecurity, the need to expand into every room, to fill every silence. I had been guilty of it myself, in my younger years, before the weight of the crown had pressed most of that out of me. Watching Sin work quietly in the candlelight, I thought about the reports Call had brought me that morning when I'd asked about her. She was 28 or thereabouts, from Fenwick originally, but she had been living at the border settlement called Cairwatch for 2 years, had moved there, Call said carefully, after the sickness had passed through Fenwick. The sickness 2 years ago, the one that had taken. I had stopped him there. I knew the sickness he meant. I had known about it when it happened, had sent healers from the capital, had sent medicines, had done what a king does, which is to say he does what he can from a great distance, and sometimes it is not enough. The sickness had taken most of Fenwick's population in the space of 3 weeks, nearly 200 people. 2 years ago, that winter. The same winter that my loss had occurred. I stood in the corridor with this knowledge settling through me, and watched her sort herbs in the candlelight, and felt something I had not felt in 2 years. Something warm and specific, and frightening in the way that warmth is frightening when you have not felt it for a very long time. I recognized it the way you recognize a language you once spoke fluently, and have not spoken in so long you thought you had forgotten it. The recognition ran ahead of understanding. I did not let myself examine it closely. I went back to my study and worked until the candles burned down. That evening, I did something I had not done in 2 years. I went to the door of the den and pushed it open and went inside. I don't know what I expected. I had been telling myself for 2 years that I could go in whenever I chose to, that the threshold of that doorway held no particular power over me, that I simply had not found the right moment. I understood now, standing on the inside of the door for the first time since the winter that had changed everything, that this was a lie I had been telling myself with great conviction. The den was small and stone-walled and warm from a brazier in the far corner that Call had built in during the first winter, when the healers had started coming. It smelled of old stone and pine and the particular warm animal smell of wolf, and underneath that, faint and steady, pine resin and dried herbs. Roth was lying 5 feet from the far wall now. He had moved again. Sen was sitting where she'd been the night before, back against the wall, candle beside her. She looked up when I came in, one quick, assessing look, and then she looked back at the wolf, and she did not say anything. I stood inside the door. I could feel Roth's awareness of me like a physical thing, not the rejection he gave the healers, not the blankness he had given me. Something else, something tentative. He had not looked at me, not directly, but his great silver ears had turned toward me the way a horse turns its ear toward a familiar voice. I sat down on the floor. It was not a graceful thing to do. I was not small and I was not young, and the stone was cold, and the Alpha King of Drevin did not sit on den floors. And yet, I sat down, 3 feet from Sen, with my back against the wall beside hers, and I looked at Roth. Neither of us spoke for a long time. He moved, I said finally. Unnecessary, she had been here, she had seen it. He moves at night, she said, slowly. While I'm asleep, I think, when he believes I'm not watching. I looked at Roth. His eyes were on the floor. He always was proud, I said. It came out quieter than I intended. She didn't answer, but I felt her attention shift slightly, not toward me exactly, but toward what I'd said. He came to me, I said, when I was 16. That's not the typical way of things. Usually a bonded wolf is assigned or chosen through the pack right. Roth just appeared at my window one morning during a winter storm and sat there until I opened it. I paused. He had an opinion about most things from the very beginning. From the corner of my eye, I saw the faint movement of her mouth, not quite a smile, but something close. What happened, she said, 2 years ago. It was not a question. But it was an opening, and she left it precisely there, not pushing on it, not closing it. I was quiet for a long moment. The brazier made its small sounds. Roth breathed. My sister, I said. She was the closest person to me in the world. She died in the first hard week of that winter. It was, I stopped, looked at the wolf. It was sudden. She had been entirely healthy. Sometimes that is how it happens. Sen said nothing. She did not offer me condolences, which I had received 2 years of and which had long since ceased to mean anything. And she did not look at me with the particular careful pity people arrange on their faces when they do not know what else to do. She simply stayed where she was, sitting with what I had said the same way she had been sitting with the wolf, present and unhurried, and not requiring anything. Roth loved her, I said. She used to come to the den and sit with him the way you, I stopped again, the way you're sitting with him now. A silence. I'm sorry, she said finally, not the formal condolence, just the plain words. I looked at her. In the candlelight, her face was still and open, the face of someone who knew the particular texture of that kind of loss and was not pretending otherwise. Call told me about Fenwick, I said. I'm sorry I did not do more. I sent what the capital could send, but it was not enough, she said without any bitterness. It wasn't enough. But you sent it, which was more than some would have done. We sat in silence for a while longer. The same winter, I said. The same winter, she said. Roth had turned his head. I felt it before I saw it, a shift in the den's particular atmosphere, a change in the quality of his breathing. I looked and he was looking back, not at me, at her, and then, slow and wondering, at me. It was the first time he had looked at me in 4 months. I felt something behind my sternum that I had no name for, an ache that was not grief, that was newer than grief, that had the quality of a new thing growing up through very old ground. I stayed in the den until she fell asleep against the wall. Then I covered her with my own cloak, The one I had carried in from the corridor, an old Border Patrol cloak, nothing ceremonial, and went back to my rooms. I did not sleep, but I was less alone in my sleeplessness than I had been for 2 years. On the third morning, I canceled my counsel. Call received this information with the restraint of a man who had been managing my decisions for 8 years, and had learned that sometimes the Alpha King makes choices that seem inexplicable and turn out to be necessary. He asked no questions. He rearranged the morning. I went to the den. Sen was awake. The cloak was folded neatly beside her satchel. She had not asked whose it was. She was eating bread from the kitchen tray and looking at Roth with the patient, unhurried attention she brought to everything. And Roth was. I stopped in the doorway. He was sitting up. He had not sat up in 2 years. He was sitting with the awkward, uncertain posture of a creature that has not used its muscles for a very long time, a little unsteady, his great head slightly lowered. But he was sitting. His eyes were on Sen. I stood in the doorway and was completely still. Sen set down her bread. She did not move toward him. She held out her hand, not reaching, not extending, just offering, her palm open and turned upward, resting on her knee. Roth looked at her hand for a long time. He rose. It was slow and effortful. I could see the shake in his haunches, the long, unused strength having to remember itself, and he crossed the den one deliberate step at a time, 4 feet 5, until he stood before her. He lowered his great head and pressed it into her open hands. I have been Alpha of Drevhin for 17 years. I have stood in the field and felt the ground shake with the movement of 1,000 wolves. I have been present at the pack right 3 times and felt the whole body resonance of a bonded wolf recognizing its alpha. I have felt things in this role that have no equivalent anywhere else in my life. Nothing had prepared me for what happened to my chest in the moment. Roth pressed his head into Sen's hands. It was like a key turning in a lock I had not known was there, like a compass needle swinging to find north after years of spinning, like the first breath after surfacing from very deep water. It hit me so completely that for a moment I could not move. I stood in the doorway with my hand on the doorframe and felt the mate bond flare through me from sternum to spine, undeniable, irresistible, the clearest and most certain thing I had felt in 2 years or possibly in my entire life. She was my fated mate. The recognition was not a thought. It was a fact arriving in my body the way daylight arrives, not gradually, not by argument, but all at once and obviously. How it had taken 3 days I could not account for, except that perhaps I had been so defended against feeling anything that the bond had had to find a way in through Roth instead of through me directly. Through the one part of me I could not wall off, because I had already lost him to grief, and I could not lose him again. Sen had her hands in Roth's ruff. He was leaning against her with the full weight of a very large, very old wolf. Her face was bent over him. I could see the tears on her face. She was not trying to hide them, and I understood that this was her grief too, being released through the same small door. I crossed the threshold. I had not crossed it in 2 years, and I crossed it now without deciding to, which is the only way I could have done it. My legs simply carried me across the stone floor, and then I was kneeling beside her, my knees on the cold stone, close enough that I could feel the warmth from her and from Roth both. She looked up. I don't know what she saw in my face. Whatever it was, she did not flinch from it. She held it the way she had been holding everything, steady and present, and not requiring it to be anything other than what it was. And then the thing I had been holding behind iron for 2 winters. The thing I had built a wall around because I was a king, and there was no other choice, because the keep had to run, and the territories had to be managed, and the pack had to be led, and there was simply no room in any of that for the truth of how broken I was came through. I wept. I am not certain I can describe it adequately. It was not the tidy, contained grief of a man who maintains his dignity. It was the grief of 2 years unlocked all at once, the grief of a cold den floor and an empty corridor and my sister's name going unsaid in this keep for so long that I had started to wonder if I had imagined her. It was the grief of being the Alpha King and having no one to be simply a man in front of. It was everything. Sen did not say anything. She did not move away. She moved her hand from Roth's ruff and placed it over mine on the stone floor, and she stayed. Roth lay down across both of us, his great warm weight sprawled over our legs, his head on my knee. He was breathing differently. He was breathing the way he used to breathe, slow and deep and matched to mine. The two heartbeats that had been synchronized since I was 16 falling back into their old rhythm, imperfect and halting, and then steadier. I do not know how long we stayed like that. I became aware at some point of sounds from the corridor. Not intrusive sounds, Call had more sense than that, but the presence of people. The council members who had been told the morning's meeting was cancelled, and who had, apparently, drifted toward the keep's heart in the way people do when something has shifted in a place, and they can feel it without knowing why. I became aware of them and did not care. I had spent 2 years caring, very carefully, about every impression I made. About the image of an Alpha King who was in command of himself, who moved through his grief without being moved by it, who ran his keep and managed his territories and made his decisions with steady hands and a level voice. I had been very good at it. I had been so good at it that I had convinced myself it was the only way forward, that the alternative, the cracking, the releasing, the allowing of what was real, was simply not available to a person in my position. I had been wrong about this. I understood that now with the clarity of something that has just been demonstrated beyond argument. Roth lifted his head and looked at me with his old eyes, not the empty eyes of these 2 years, but the eyes I remembered, the eyes that had opinions and assessments, and a kind of wry wolf intelligence that I had missed so profoundly I had stopped letting myself think about it. He looked at me with those eyes for a long moment. Then he looked at Sen. His tail moved, once, a slow, deliberate sweep. I heard someone in the corridor make a soft sound, a catch of breath. Call, I thought. He had known Roth since the wolf's first year in this keep. He would understand what it meant that the tail had moved. I helped Sen to her feet. She was stiff from the floor. 3 days of stone, even with a cloak, is a significant undertaking, and she bore it with the practical matter-of-factness of someone accustomed to discomfort. I kept hold of her hand after she was standing. She looked down at our joined hands, and then up at me. "My lord," she said, quiet, careful. "Aldrich," I said. She considered this for a moment. I could see her working out what it meant, offered like that, without ceremony or explanation. She was quick. She understood more than she said, which I had begun to understand was simply how she was. "Aldrich," she said, testing it. It sounded right. It sounded the way a name sounds when said by someone who has the right to use it. I led her out of the den. The council was in the corridor, Call and 3 of the territorial lords and 2 of the senior pack advisors, arranged in the way of people who have not exactly been eavesdropping, but have not been far from doing so. They looked at us as we came through the door, at my face, at Sen's face, at our joined hands, at Roth, who had followed us to the doorway of the den for the first time in 2 years and stood there watching. I watched them understand. It did not happen all at once. It happened person by person, the recognition moving through the group like light moves through water, a shift, a settling, a change in how they were holding themselves. Call was first. He had known me for 8 years, and I think he had been waiting for something like this without knowing what shape it would take. He bowed his head, not the formal bow, but the real one, the one that means something. The lords followed, one and then another and then the third. The pack advisors. No one said anything. There was nothing to say. What had happened in the den was plain enough. I did not ask for their approval. I had not needed to. The bond was not a question that required their answer. That night, for the first time in 2 years, I slept. The weeks that followed were quiet. Not the quietness of a keep holding its breath, the quietness of a place that has exhaled. Roth ate the second morning. Not much, a little meat carefully as though relearning the mechanism. But he ate, and by the end of that week he was eating regularly. And by the second week he had begun coming out of the den into the great hall, which he had not done since the winter of my sister's death. The first time he padded into the great hall during a council meeting and lay down at Sen's feet. She had been sitting at the far end of the room, going through her herb notes, staying out of the business she felt was not hers. Lord Venn stopped mid-sentence and stared. I watched Venn look at the wolf, and at the woman the wolf had chosen as the place to be, and at me, and then arrange his face into something careful and respectful. The territorial lords were all men of the northern packs. They understood wolf bonds better than most. They understood that a bonded wolf does not choose a person by accident. None of them said anything that needed to be addressed. I had been putting off, not out of avoidance exactly, but out of a caution I struggled to name, the question of what I was going to say to Sen about what she was to me, about what I knew and what it meant. She was not, I understood very clearly, someone who would respond well to being told. Sen did not receive declarations. She received evidence. She assessed it quietly and came to her own conclusions, and those conclusions were, in my experience of her over these weeks, consistently correct. I had given her the use of a proper room on the keep's upper level. She had accepted this without protest, and without making anything of it, which seemed characteristic. She had written to a friend in Cairwatch asking for her things to be sent. She had integrated herself into the keep's daily life with a naturalness that made it hard to remember she had not always been here. She was good with the wolves of the pack. They found her. I would come across her in the courtyard or the upper meadow with 2 or 3 pack wolves lying around her while she worked, and the pack wolves were not known for seeking out strangers. She did not chase them away and did not try to make herself interesting to them. She simply did not run them off, and they, apparently, found this exceptional. I found this exceptional. I found everything about her exceptional, which was inconvenient and wonderful in equal measure. I went to her room one evening, late in that first month, when the keep had gone quiet, and there was no council to answer to and no particular reason for being anywhere. I knocked. She opened the door in her plain gray sleep robe with her hair down, which I had not seen before, and she looked at me with that assessing gray gaze. "Come in," she said, stepping back. Her room was warm. She had made it her own, herbs drying at the window, a small carved wooden horse on the sill that had clearly traveled some distance, the cloak I had left her in the den, kept, folded over the chair back. Books from the keep's library, stacked with small pieces of dried fern marking pages. I sat in the chair by the fire. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited, not impatiently. "I should explain to you," I said, "what I believe has been happening, what I know has been happening but perhaps have not said clearly enough." She looked at me. "You are my fated mate," I said. "I felt the mate bond when Roth pressed his head into your hands. I should have told you immediately. I delayed because I was not certain how to say it in a way that didn't sound like an announcement being made to someone who didn't ask." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. I looked at her. "I've known since the second evening," she said. "Something felt, I don't know the word. Like the right key in the right lock. I thought I might be wrong. I thought it might be grief making me reach for something." A pause. "I've been waiting to see if you would say it or if you needed me to wait longer." "How long would you have waited?" I said. Her mouth moved into that almost smile. "I'm very patient," she said. "You may have noticed." "I had noticed," I said. She looked at me in the firelight for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't want a ceremony. I don't want the formal rite in the great hall with the lords watching. I understand that you probably have obligations around how this is announced, and I'm not trying to make your life difficult, but—" "I have no interest in a ceremony," I said. "I have had 17 years of ceremonies." What I would like is to ask you a plain question, and have you give me a plain answer." She waited. "Will you stay?" I said. "Not as the fated mate and all the weight that comes with it. Not as the alpha queen or whatever title Call decides is the appropriate one. Just will you stay, here, with Roth and me? Will you make this keep your home?" The fire burned quietly. She looked at me with those gray eyes, pine tree gray in winter light, and what was in them was the same thing that had been in them from the first evening when she had walked into that den and sat down on the cold floor and simply been present. "I already am," she said. "I should tell you what became of the keep in the months that followed, because this story does not end with that room. Roth recovered. Not all at once. Recovery, I learned from watching him, is not a straight line back to what was before. It is a different path, one that runs through the same country but arrives at a slightly different place. He was never again quite the wolf he had been before that winter. There was a quality of hard-won knowledge in him now, a depth he had gained in those 2 years lying on the stone floor that I would not have traded. He ran again. He led the pack wolves on the winter hunt before the year was out, and came home silver-coated and breathing hard and deeply satisfied, and lay down at the hearth with his head on Sen's feet and slept for 12 hours. Sen became what she had been quietly becoming from the first week, the person the keep arranged itself around. Not because I arranged it that way, I had not needed to. The kitchen found she could be consulted about medicinal herbs and began keeping a better larder for it. The pack wolves sought her out, and the pack's general health improved because she noticed things about them that the formal healers had missed. The council members, even Lord Venn, who had most reason to be cautious about change, came to trust her judgment on matters she had opinions about, because her opinions turned out to be reliable. She wrote to Carewatch, and had a young woman she trusted brought up to take over the healer's work there, so the border settlement would not be left without care. This was practical and thoughtful and cost her something. She had built a life in Carewatch over 2 years, and she was leaving it behind, and she did it without making a production of the sacrifice. When I told her I had noticed, she said she preferred to do what was useful rather than what was easy and moved on to the next thing. I had been in love with difficult, impressive people before. This was different. This was the ease of recognizing someone who had been shaped by the same forces you had been shaped by and come through them with the same understanding. There was nothing to perform for each other. There was just the keeping and the pack and the cold northern winters and the warmth we made between us from what we had both endured separately. Call, who had served me for 8 years and observed more of my private nature than most, said to me once in his careful way that the keep felt different. I asked him how. He thought about it for a moment and then said, "Inhabited." He was right, that was the word. I had been running this keep for 17 years as a kind of stewardship, keeping it functional, keeping it governed, keeping it moving. It had not felt inhabited in a very long time. It did now. The formal title came, eventually. It was unavoidable, and Call handled the announcement with his usual diplomatic competence. The lords of the Territorial Council received it with varying degrees of warmth, but they received it, which was what mattered, and the ones who might have had objections had spent enough weeks watching Roth choose her, and watching her make herself useful and honest, and watching me be a word I had not used about myself in 2 years, well, that they found their objections difficult to sustain. The pack right, which confirms the alpha's mate to the pack's wolves, happened on a clear evening in the first deep winter of that year. The pack was assembled in the upper meadow, all the Drevhin wolves, silver and gray and winter white in the cold air, and Sen stood at my side in her gray cloak. She had declined the ceremonial one which I had expected, and the pack wolves looked at her, and then they simply sat down. All of them. At once. The way wolves sit when they have made a decision. Roth sat beside her, and was enormous and pleased with himself. There is a thing that happens in a pack right when the bond is recognized. A sound, not exactly heard so much as felt, a resonance below sound, the wolves' acknowledgement running through the air. I had felt it twice before at the rites of my predecessors. I felt it again then, and it was different from how I remembered it, not more powerful, exactly, but more personal, more like something that had always been true, being said aloud for the first time. Afterward, when the pack had returned to the trees, and the meadow was empty except for Sen and me and Roth, she put her hand in mine. "That was remarkable," she said. "Yes," I said. "And very cold." She looked at the sky, which was beginning to produce the particular haze that means snow before morning. "Can we go inside?" We went inside. I think sometimes about the morning I sent for her, the defeated morning, the morning after the 12th healer had been turned away, when Call had come to me with that careful neutral face, and the name of a village healer from Fenwick Border who was known for sitting with creatures that had given up. I had been the creature that had given up. Not completely. I had been a king, and a king does not have the luxury of a full giving up, and I had done what was required of me every day regardless. But in the place underneath the requirements, in the place where Roth lived and where my sister had lived, and where the things that were genuinely mine rather than the crown's resided, in that place I had given up. I had decided that what was left was what I had. And what I had was the cold stone and the running keep and the silent wolf and the long corridor where I stood at night and could not sleep. She arrived at dusk and sat down on the floor and stayed. It seems from where I am now like a simple thing, the simplest thing, someone sitting down and staying. 2 years of celebrated healers with their formal training and their complicated remedies. And what Roth had needed was someone who knew the weight of 2 years of grief and was not afraid of sitting inside it. What I had needed was the same. We had both, she and I, been doing the thing that people who have survived very bad winters learn to do. We had been enduring alone, putting one day after another, getting through. It is a necessary skill, and I will not speak badly of it. There are winters that require nothing else, and the surviving of them is its own kind of valor. But endurance alone has a ceiling. It keeps you alive. It does not return you to living. She taught me that. Not deliberately. Sen does not teach deliberately. She does not have the temperament for deliberate instruction. She taught me by demonstrating, by sitting down on the cold floor and staying and showing me, without a word about it, that endurance was something you could do alongside someone rather than always in spite of being alone. I think about my sister too. I think about her every day. That has not changed, and I have stopped expecting it to. But the quality of the thinking has changed. It is less like pressing on a wound and more like touching a scar, the record of something real, the proof that something happened that mattered, the mark that something which was there remains in you in a changed form. My sister would have liked Sen. She would have liked her enormously. She would have asked 1,000 questions and followed her around the keep asking opinions about things and borrowed her books and returned them with dried flowers pressed between the pages as markers. She would have called her by her given name from the first hour. I believe this with certainty. I do not know why, but I do. It is a cold morning as I write this, if you can call what I am doing writing, which is more honestly talking into the air of this study with the fire going and Roth asleep at my feet and the snow heavy on the courtyard stones. Sen is down the corridor somewhere doing whatever she does at this hour, which is usually 3 things at once in her quiet, unhurried way. In a few minutes she will come to the study door and knock once and put her head in and ask if I want tea, because this is what she does when the morning is cold, and she has been moving around the keep since before the second watch, and she has noticed, from long practice, that I forget to eat or drink anything when I am in the middle of a long thought. I will say yes. She will come in with 2 cups and set one at my elbow and take the other to the fire and sit in the chair across from Roth and read whatever she brought from the library. She will not interrupt my work. She will not fill the silence. She will simply be here. I will do my best work of the morning after she comes in. I have noticed this pattern, and I have not commented on it because some things do not need commentary. That is what I want to tell you, I think. If there is a thing to be told, not the ceremony, not the formal rite in the meadow, not the lords of the council bowing in the corridor, while a silver wolf pressed his head into a stranger's hands. Those things happened and they mattered. But the thing I come back to is simpler. She came to the den and sat down on the cold floor. She stayed. That was when everything began. The snow outside is building. I can hear it against the stones, the particular sound of northern winter settling in for the long work of being cold. Roth sighs in his sleep and shifts, so that his great paws are closer to the warmth of the hearth. My cup is nearly empty. Down the corridor a door opens and there is the sound of unhurried footsteps and the quiet sound of the kitchen kettle being handled, and then a knock at the study door. "Come in," I say. And she does.